Hey there guys, so today I'm taking a look at something that I think is pretty interesting. I saw that on Minisforum's website you could buy some refurbished units. And well, this is a refurbished unit of their UM270 Mini PC. I got this for $75. Now that was with a coupon that they were running at the time. It was a $30 off coupon. The normal price of this was about $100. So with taxes and everything it came out to about 75 bucks. Now this is rocking the Ryzen 7 2700U. That is the first generation of Ryzen APUs. So this is quite an old unit, but at the price point that it was at, it was very interesting to take a look at. It's one of the older Minisforum's designs. As you can see here, this is a chassis that they used pretty early on in their Ryzen units. They stopped using it, I believe, past the 4000 series, but it is a pretty interesting design. I mean, it has the front USBs as we normally see on most mini PCs. It even has a USB-C, but this isn't a USB-C alt mode or anything like that. Interestingly enough, in my unit, there's a slight dent right here. So again, it is a refurbished unit, but it doesn't really matter to me for $75. If we look at the back, we do see, again, two USB. These are USB 3.0s. We have an HDMI. We have DisplayPort. I love seeing the inclusion of DisplayPort. And we have 2 gigabit Ethernet ports. Now, one thing that I do like about this older Minisforum design is the fact that it's very easy to get into. We can very quickly pop it open like that, and you can see the inside. As you can see, I'm using a SATA SSD because it does have an SSD slot there, but it is a SATA M.2, and that I did not know that when I got the unit. So when I tried to put in an NVMe in there, I was confused on why it just would not show up. And well, it comes down to the fact that this is a SATA slot, so you can only use SATA SSDs. Unfortunately, I don't have any M.2 SATA SSDs, and quite frankly, those are very difficult to find nowadays. Even good quality 2.5-inch SSDs are very hard to find. This unit I've had for years now, and it does have DRAM, so it is a pretty decent unit. But if I ever needed to replace this thing, I'm pretty much screwed. And I did put 32 gigabytes of RAM in here. It is 3200 mega transfers RAM, but it's not going to run at that speed. I think this thing is capped at 2400 mega transfers, so pretty slow, but it is a first generation DDR4 unit. And it's very easy to open these things up and close them. There's some residue there from a sticker that it had on here. I never got around to cleaning that. But it is a metal construction, so it's nice to see that. Though the bottom itself is plastic, but you never really need to mess with any of this. And it was a bare bones unit, so I had to put in an SSD, I had to put in the RAM. And this is just RAM that I had, and well, I thought the SSD was going to be an easier scenario. I had an M.2 that I was going to use for this thing, but in all honesty, it's still perfectly fine with the SATA SSD that I have in there. But I was very curious to take a look at this unit because, again, it's first generation of Ryzen APUs. And considering that at this point we are so far into the lifespan of Ryzen, we've seen so many redesigns, and we've seen essentially the rise of mini PCs happen within the lifespan of Ryzen and Ryzen APUs in particular. It's kind of fun to be able to look at a system that is from a bygone era. You know, back in this day and age, the 2700U was the top end of the mobile APUs that you can get at the time. You know, on the desktop side of things, we didn't even have a Ryzen 7 version. We had a Ryzen 5, and that was the 2400G. But don't let the Ryzen 7 in the name of this thing confuse you. This is literally just a 2400G. And in fact, it's the same 4-core, 4-thread configuration. The iGPU is pretty much identical. Though on the mobile side of things, the iGPU has 1 fewer core. So if anything, this is worse than the 2400G, though realistically at the clock speeds that these were running at and with the speeds that the RAM was running at for these systems, even if it had that extra core, it wouldn't do anything. And the 2400G for the most part would perform better due to the fact that you could use XMP memory with it, and that improved your timings. And because of the overclocking nature of those APUs, you could really get some crazy boost by making changes to those timings. So you definitely should not expect 2400G performance out of this thing, but I'm very curious how it's going to actually perform. And well, I already have it out of the box. I've already been messing with it for a little bit, and an interesting thing about it is the fact that the TDP of this thing is very low. In the testing that I did, it seems to cap out at about 11 watts, which is not even what is standard in a lot of the systems that you would see with this thing for the most part. I mean, it claimed to have 15 to 25 watt TDP TDP by default on most systems, but in a lot of cases, it really ended up being more of a 10 to 15 watt scenario most of the time, due to the fact that, especially at this era when the first Ryzen APUs came out, PC and laptop manufacturers were just not taking Ryzen seriously. So the laptops that you would see that would have Ryzen processors or APUs would be very, very misconfigured. A lot of the times they were mostly just repurposing Intel designs, and as such weren't really able to handle the TDP, or they were purposely using worse laptop designs in general because Intel was not happy to actually have some real competition for once. And while seeing such a low TDP for this thing is a little disappointing, but let's just jump into the performance numbers so we can really talk about the performance of this thing. So starting off the gaming benchmarks, we're going to be taking a look at a game that I have been putting an irresponsible amount of hours into, and that is Civilization 6. And of course, we are running the AI benchmark. We're running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, but we are at the full 1080p resolution. And you know, I went into this thing with some pretty low expectations, and somehow it managed to still blow away those low expectations with a turn time of 93.88 seconds. That's right, 93, almost 94 full seconds per turn on this benchmark. That's almost double the turn time of a system like the Beelink Mini S13. This is the most disastrous result I have ever seen in this game, and it's honestly really impressive to see. And this was the very first thing that I tested on this system, so my expectations were now below the mantle of the earth. And keep in mind, this is the average turn time. The first turn in this benchmark ended up taking more than 2 minutes to happen. It is insane how slow this thing is in Civilization 6, a game that is at this point almost a decade old. Now, to be fair, the last DLC did end up coming out way later than that, but the base of the game is almost 10 years old, and it is performing this bad. This is a title from about around the era that this APU was relevant, and this result is just tremendously bad. So after the results in Civilization 6, I did decide to try out something that is significantly lighter and significantly easier to run, and that is Combat Master, a Call of Duty clone that is mostly just meant to be a insanely wacky Call of Duty that works on mobile. And because of that, it tends to be a pretty easy game to run on practically every system that I've ever tested it on. In fact, for the most part, I always try it out at the ultra graphics settings. And that's exactly what it defaulted to here, because that's the last settings that I ended up using, and the result wasn't exactly spectacular. While we were getting around a 60 FPS average, those 1% lows ending up all the way down into the 20s was pretty disastrous. It just did not feel as smooth to play as this game normally does. One of the reasons that I enjoy playing this game in general is that when you're on a normal desktop or even just a decent mini PC, you can get an FPS number that is in the hundreds. So if you have a high refresh rate display, this thing just feels amazing to play, and that is just not the case here, but we are at the ultra graphics settings. So in the interest of not wanting to sacrifice any resolution, I did end up turning down the graphics settings to the lowest to see what the performance was like. And well, the results were kind of surprising. If we just look at the FPS average, there was a pretty decent bump in performance, dropping things down to the lowest graphics settings, where we see a roughly 30 FPS increase there. But that's immediately taken away when we see that the 1% low only increased by about 7 frames. So not even a double-digit increase in the 1% low. And you really feel that in the game, and you could even see it in the frame times, where a lot of things just end up causing spikes. And in general, it's just not a smooth and consistent experience, which is what I'm so used to in this game. This was by far the worst time I've ever had playing this game. And that's pretty mind-boggling here. So at this point, I was just really curious to see what we could get to run on here even remotely decently. So I decided to check out Killing Floor 2, one of my favorite titles, and a game that is also almost a decade old. And one interesting thing about this game is that on any new system that I downloaded on, it always defaults the resolution to 720p, and usually this is pretty annoying, but in this case, it's pretty much a necessity. And in general, leaving the resolution at 720p and setting the graphics to their lowest gave a pretty decent result in this title, where I ended up with an FPS average in the mid 80s and a 1% low that is in the low 40s. While it's not perfect 1% lows, especially considering we're at 720p, this title felt really great to play. And I'm just happy to have even remotely a W, even if it has some asterisks to it, just after the experience of those last two games. And it helps that Killing Floor 2 is one of those titles that has insane amounts of replay value, and if you and your friends just need a title that you can jump into and have fun together and mostly just sit around and chat and turn your brain off, this is pretty much it. And luckily, since the spring sale is happening right now, you could pick up this title for really cheap. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, it's just a title that I really enjoy, so definitely check it out, especially if you have a system like this, because you're gonna need 720p in the lowest settings, but at least you'll be able to play it. Now, hands down, the most surprising game to me ended up being Monster Hunter Rise. I played this game at the lowest in-game graphics settings, and the FPS average that I got, as well as the 1% lows, were really remarkably good. Now, this is one of those titles that runs pretty well on most systems, but even systems that I've tried out with the N100, N95, and N150 have just not done super well on here. It's definitely a lot closer to a 30 FPS average on those systems, and it's a pretty impressive result considering what they have. But this system here was getting an above 60 FPS average with 1% lows that were almost at 60, which means this is a perfect experience for the most part. It should be noted though that when you set the lowest in-game graphics settings in this title, it does set a target render resolution of about 720p if you have a 1080p display. So that's pretty much why it's running so well on here. The game is rendering at 720p. But with the same settings, systems with those Intel processors don't do anywhere near this good. And considering that this was only $75, about half the price, or even more so than some of these systems with the N100 and N150, I'm pretty impressed with the results here, especially considering how low the TDP is just set to and just how underpowered that iGPU is by today's standards. It at least still manages to beat out Intel's current offering on the low end. Of course, I couldn't let this system build up any kind of self-esteem, so it immediately had to be humbled. I booted up Counter-Strike 2 since it is the most popular game on Steam, and this is running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, though we aren't using FSR, and as you can see, the results here were absolutely disastrous, with 1% lows that were struggling to even make it into the double digits, and an FPS average that could not even hope to get close to 60. This result was pretty brutal, and this is after 6 runs. I kept trying to see if after a while there would be some kind of improvement, and no, it was pretty much consistently within this range. So this is about as good as you're going to be able to get. Of course, the benchmark that I'm running for Counter-Strike 2 is a very demanding scenario. If you're playing the game normally, you are going to get better results than this, but it's not drastically better results. And with just how badly this is running, it's going to be an absolute disaster because the stutters are going to be a nightmare to deal with. And you know, it's interesting. I decided to try out BioShock Infinite, a game that is 12 years old. A title so old, it could be addicted to Roblox and Fortnite today. And even a title this old was not really able to get a great result on this system. I did run it at the full 1080p resolution with the medium graphics setting, so it's not the very lowest or anything like that, but medium isn't really anywhere near the most aggressive settings you can go with. But this 2013 title was still just not able to get a 60 FPS average, and the 1% lows, while they weren't terrible, they weren't remarkable either. And again, this is just at medium graphics settings. This is about what you have to set it to so that it doesn't look horrifically awful. It still looks pretty decent. Dropping down to 720p with the exact same graphics settings of medium really does help improve your results in terms of the FPS average, finally giving you an above 60 FPS average consistently across the board with the FPS average, but those 1% lows end up dragging down the experience. And that means that the inconsistencies that happen at 1080p are still going to carry over to 720p. It's just not an ideal situation, but it's pretty clear that for this system, 720p is the target. It's what you want to go with. But let's move on now to the CPU benchmarks, because the results here were really pretty interesting to me. So the Ryzen 7 2700U in Cinebench R23 ended up getting a multi-core score of 3,186. That puts it just above the Intel N150 and pretty close in results as well with the N95 and the N100. Not too surprising there, those three chips are pretty much identical to each other. What's interesting is that it ends up falling behind the i5 6600K. Not too surprising there, because while the i5 6600K is only a 4-core 4-thread CPU versus the 4 cores 8 threads of the 2700U, the single core results really shed some light here, where we end up seeing that the 2700U ends up scoring around the same level for the single core score of the N100. And that means it's just below the N95 and the N150 versus the i5 6600K that ends up getting a score of 1,160. And keep in mind that the multi-core score is going to get pretty reduced in comparison to that single core performance because of the fact that the TDP of the system is just so low. Those 11 watts have to be shared amongst 4 cores and 8 threads. Meanwhile, the i5 6600K gets a full 95 watts to work with. So drastically different scenarios there, and if anything, it's more impressive that they score so close to each other. Of course, the 2400G with a much higher TDP allocated to it ends up getting a score of 4,361, and the single core performance is, while still above it, still a very close result. And of course, it does lag behind the i5 6600K. But if we compare that to a bit more of a modern Ryzen 7, that being something like the Ryzen 7 7840HS, well, the single core performance is leaps and bounds better on that system, and the multi-threaded performance is on a completely different planet. And of course, that is almost a decade of improvement there, and that's not even the latest and greatest today. We're talking about a previous generation product. Though it's a little misleading there because of the fact that with Zen 5 processors, all we've seen is price increases. And I'm talking about specifically on the mobile side of things. Zen 5 processors ended up coming with such a price premium that currently in the market, it's very difficult to find any systems with those chips for less than $1,000. With most mini PCs that have it on the cheap side, I've seen around $650 or $700, but that's systems that are using SODIMM memory. So whatever uplifts you get from the iGPU, you're not really going to see all that much. Still, you're going to get some very powerful CPUs if that's what you care about. But with the 2700U, it really is just fighting at the bottom there, but it's holding its own. It really is holding its own, at least in Cinebench R23. Now, when we take a look at the more modern Cinebench 2024, this is where the charts change a little bit. Obviously, I have way less data to work with on here, but on the multi-core side of things, the Ryzen 7 2700U ends up having a pretty noticeable lead over the Intel N150, where the N150 ends up getting a result of 187. The Ryzen 7 2700U ends up scoring 225. In comparison, the 2400G ends up getting 276, and the Ryzen 5 5500U ends up scoring 427. And if we look at the single core score, we see the chart shifting again, where the Ryzen 7 2700U ends up scoring 55, putting it closer towards the bottom of what I have on these charts. And while we also have the Ryzen 5 2400G ending up scoring 58 on the single core, so just above the 2700U. But above both of those is the Intel N150 that ends up scoring 60. And of course, the Ryzen 5 5500U absolutely mogs all of them with a score of 68. I did decide to also test out Passmark. It's a benchmark that I don't usually look at, but the more that I've used it, the more I'm starting to realize that it is a pretty good indicator of what the relative performance of a system is going to be for regular users. And the final result there was 2100 and effectively 15. I think 14.9 we can round up there. And while I currently don't have any comparison data to show you, you can always go onto Passmark's website and take a look at this score and compare it to whatever chip that you want that is in their database. Keep in mind that TDP is greatly going to affect the results that you get on some of these chips, but I will be doing more Passmark testing for comparison's sake. So those were some pretty interesting test results there. This ended up performing at a level that was both surprising and unsurprising to me. See, the first generation of Ryzen APUs on mobile at least weren't exactly great. I actually had a friend who had gotten a laptop with a early Ryzen APU, and it wasn't exactly amazing, but it was a pretty decent value in comparison to the Intel systems at the time. Gotta understand that when this launched, Skylake and Kaby Lake were essentially what was coming out from Intel. And those on mobile weren't exactly amazing, specifically on the iGPU side of things, so this had some pretty decent performance. But of course, on the CPU side of things, we are looking at IPC that is closer to Haswell than it is to Skylake. The iGPU is really the most interesting part of it, and well, even on the CPU side of things, it isn't completely irrelevant. The most surprising thing to me was the multi-core performance of this thing being better than the N100. And that doesn't really mean too much, because what are you going to be doing on this device that is going to max out 4 cores and 8 threads that wouldn't benefit from you moving up to any other category? But as we saw in the gaming results, it's not too bad. I mean, at the time that this came out, 720p was really what was recommended for games. And that still holds true. 720p, you can do a lot more with this thing than you previously could, but I do want to test this thing out in one more scenario that we haven't taken a look at, and I don't usually cover, and that is emulation. I usually don't cover emulation because other peers of mine within the mini PC category have gotten hit with claims from companies like Nintendo due to talking about emulation. Retro Gaming Core being one of those people that got hit with that, and you know, I really like his channel, so seeing that happen was really scary to see. And I normally try to stay away as much as possible from emulation, but I think that this system has some interesting aspects to it, and we are going to be taking a look at more emulation related things soon, so I might as well take a look at that on here. So let's jump right into that. So the first game that I took a look at is Mario Kart Double Dash, running here at the native resolution, and you can see the game speed in the corner there, and it's running at a locked 60 FPS. This was for the most part a pretty decent experience. It certainly wasn't disastrous by any means. There was really only the occasional stutter here and there, but it was nothing that ruined the overall experience. But GameCube emulation at this point is pretty easy to do for most devices. You can even get very cheap handhelds off of AliExpress that will run these types of games very well. So the results here aren't exactly going to be game-changing by any means, but we can try to turn up the resolution to 1080p. And it was once I did this that the performance suffered slightly. While for most of the time it's locked to 60, there would be the occasional stutter that would bring things down. And this happened a lot more frequently than it did at the native resolution. So it's not the most ideal experience, but it still for the most part ran really well. I could more than comfortably get through all of the races that I did like this without really feeling like I was being held back. It wasn't perfect, but it performed better than some of the cheaper handhelds that I've seen off of AliExpress. I know it's a low bar to clear there, but it at least clears that. And after playing a few games on the GameCube, I pretty much ended up finding that the results kind of show that you're better off running at native resolution if you really want to have the most consistent experience. Things like Lego Star Wars at the 1080p resolution did end up introducing more stutters, while at native I didn't run into any issues issues in the first 3 levels. So it really seems like at this configuration of TDP, this chip just handles native resolution for the GameCube much better. That does mean that you're going to have access to emulation for a wide variety of different consoles. I mean, this is the GameCube, so you're going to be able to play NES and SNES games perfectly fine. You're going to be able to play all of the older Nintendo handhelds. I was going to try out the Switch, but I was having some issues finding a Switch emulator due to the fact that Nintendo has effectively gotten the 2 most popular Switch emulators shut down. I didn't really look too much into it because, again, emulation is not really something that I do too much, so I'm not super familiar with it. But if you guys have any recommendations for Switch emulators to use, let me know. I do have a bunch of Switch game ROMs downloaded. It's just that since Yuzu shut down, I don't really know what emulator to use with them. I know that there are some forks of Yuzu out there, but from what I was able to research, it seems like the vast majority of them were really just forks that were trying to be more of a riding the hype type of fork instead of something that any kind of development really went into them. So let me know down below anything that you recommend, but it does seem like this system is going to handle emulation, at least for older consoles, significantly better than it will a lot of modern gaming. Of course, this is a metric that becomes less and less impressive each passing year because of the fact that, well, these systems become older and older and hardware becomes more and more powerful. But at this price point, it is at least a pretty decent emulator. Considering that a lot of the emulation consoles that you'll end up finding on AliExpress end up running on very low power ARM processors, this is a pretty decent advantage. Well, that was just some quick testing, and I say quick in quotation marks there. Obviously, this video is a lot longer than I was expecting it to be, but I had a lot of fun messing around with this little thing. I really want to try it out on a wider selection of games, and I do want to do a direct comparison between this and the B-Link S13. I just think it's in a very interesting position in the market because of the fact that it came at such a low price. Now, realistically speaking, you're not going to be able to find this thing at this price point. $75 was a coupon deal that I got off of it. And it's currently sold out on Minisforum's website, but you can get the version with the Ryzen 5 2500U for $142, and that comes with 16 gigabytes of RAM and a 512 gigabyte SSD. The unit I got was a bare bones. At that price point, I don't really think it's that great of a deal, but it is there if you have some kind of morbid curiosity. But you can find the occasional interesting deal here and there on Minisforum's Refurbished store. I'm not gonna sit here and give you a blanket endorsement of that because of the fact that I only have this one experience, and the one unit that I got does have a bit of a dent on it, but it's a fully functional unit even if it's not exactly the greatest. But I am going to be taking a look at this thing in comparison to systems with the N150, and I do want to compare it with some of the more recent systems just to show the generational leaps that we've seen with Ryzen mini PCs over the years. But I hope you guys found this interesting and had as much fun with it as I did. If you liked the video, be sure to like and subscribe. Check out the merch store down below, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.